So let's start off with making sure that we're all talking about the same thing. What are biometrics and how have you seen them currently implemented out into the consumer landscape? So when we talk about biometrics, we're talking about things like fingerprints, voice recognition, vein mapping, iris scans, and facial recognition. And you're gonna, you've already probably become familiar with these as you've used your cell phones, your laptops, and even getting into building security. And I want to talk to you before we talk about, how biometrics are replacing passwords. I want to talk to you about the fundamental concerns or the fundamental security risks of biometrics. First, we need to understand, how is this information stored? So when you capture some sort of piece of biometric data, it's then converted into what's called a biometric template. And this is a binary mathematical representation of the original data, such as a fingerprint, and it's turned into zeros and ones. Now, the zeros and ones also, they're trying to replicate, the endings of a line in the fingerprint or bifurcations and ridges. And it's really hard to take that template and then to reverse engineer it into a fingerprint. But I do want to tell you some stories about going back to how some of these biometrics can be exploited, in particular with fingerprints. There is a hacker group in Germany that followed around a local sheriff. And when he left his cup of coffee at a restaurant, they were able to take that cup of coffee and get a transference of his fingerprint. And then they were actually able to, using something as simple as silly putty, to recreate this man's fingerprint. And then what they did is they mailed out copies of these fingerprints to all of their newsletter base. And his fingerprint was then found all over Germany. And it was a sort of a prank, but I think that what you can take away from that is understanding that, yes, there is definitely a possibility that a fingerprint can be replicated. It's also kind of an arduous process, and the benefit would really have to be there. So I wouldn't expect someone to, to fake a fingerprint for something like a $10 transaction. I would think a fingerprint would be replicated in terms of getting access to sensitive data, assets, and large quantities of money. Now, something that I was really glad to hear about on today's call is voice recognition. I really am starting to see this in a lot of customer service spaces and in your call centers, and it does really cut down the amount of time that the customer is on the call. And it also just provides this digital experience, which I think at least in the financial services industry, we're definitely trying to target, a more seamless and all digital experience. Vein mapping. This is something that you may not have heard of before. So you can actually scan the veins in your forearm, and this can be used as a map, and this can give you access to whatever. Can vein mapping be replicated? It can. A similar group to the one in Germany said, you know what, that looks hard and challenging, but let's just see if we can do it. And they actually were able to reconstruct a prosthetic forearm that replicated the vein mapping of a human being. And you also have to remember that some of those software that is looking at biometrics, they're also doing what's called like a livability or proof of life test. So the software should actually be able to tell the difference between a human and a replication. But just the fact that that ability and that ingenuity is available is really astounding information to me. And it does make me kind of consider that as we are, fraud experts in this space, should we maybe start considering the idea of synthetic fingerprints? Going back to the zeros and ones and how that can't be reverse manipulated into an actual fingerprint, I'm not so sure that it wouldn't fail if the software doesn't have that livability factor. So if the software is just looking for those zeros and ones, I think that it can be replicated. That piece where you're talking about proof of life, that's really an essential part of a biometrics program. So where is that data stored? So a lot of times you're going to see that data stored on the end user's device. So I know that to open my phone, my fingerprint is stored on my phone. But you can also, for larger organizations, let's say we need a fingerprint to get into specific rooms within our organization, then you're going to have what's called a biometric server. Now, as with all servers, it's vulnerable to data breach. And so you have to be aware of making that trade-off and what are the security protocols that you're going to put in place. One of the things that I highly recommend is that if you are to be, if you're going to be the biometric server versus using a vendor, I highly recommend that you don't store that data in the same warehouse as all of your other customer data. It's best practice to have a geospatial spread of where your data warehouses are in case of a natural disaster or something like a pandemic and you have to shut one of your centers down. But if one of those is breached and the fraudsters are not only able to access your customer data, login and password, and they're also able to get biometrics, that is going to be an explosive news article and it's going to impact your brand. So just to protect yourself and to really stop the creep and the scope of the breach, I highly recommend making sure that you have alternative sites for your data warehouse. So biometrics in the future. I'm really, really interested to see how retail payments are going to start using and leveraging this feature. So instead of using our chip cards, in some cases, we may be able to use our fingerprints. Smart homes. This is something that we're already seeing. A downfall of a smart home or smart car is that it is vulnerable to hack. And unfortunately, I've heard stories from the FBI in situations where people have been held hostage, locked into their home or locked into their car and exploited for ransom money because the fraudsters were able to literally lock them in and keep them held hostage because everything was smart. Remember, if it's smart, it's probably vulnerable. So when you keep up with the latest trends in what's available for technology, keep in mind that your risk appetite is also going to have to change. I also think that we're going to start seeing more smart workplaces. I think that as we get into a hybrid approach, I think that it's an opportunity for us to rethink, physical security and how we can best leverage some of the new technology that's coming out. And I also see hospitals already starting to use some of these features. And I think it would be a great opportunity for some of those programs within hospitals would be better able to be, better service if someone is able to use biometrics so that while they're in pain, while they're sick, they can just use a fingerprint and, just carry on with focusing on getting better rather than signing a lot of documents. Now, there's a reason that passwords won't sunset anytime soon. A single biometrical data point are typically not inclusive. And what do I mean by that? Let's say that you're strongly going to leverage a fingerprint. You have now excluded your customers, your consumers that by whatever reason don't have fingers. They have prosthetics that don't necessarily have fingerprints. And now the use of your app is not as functional for that member group. Also, I think that it's important for us to think about how we change in terms of our voice and in terms of facial recognition as we age. We have to embed some of that growth and change, that organic biological change within our biometric software. In a lot of cases, some devices and applications are only meant for one user. So if we want to have a joint banking account, we're going to need to have two thumbprints. We're going to have two voice recognitions. We're going to have two facial recognitions. So understanding that if you want to fit your customers into some sort of joint account, your biometric security should also be able to reflect that joint service. And another thing is that biometrics don't preserve your anonymity. You are putting your data into some sort of data point. It's turning into zeros and ones. And I am of the opinion that if it can be zeros and ones, it can be exploited. So yes, I use my fingerprint on my phone, and I take that risk knowing that someone could lift my fingerprint and it may actually work. So we want to understand that we are risking a little bit of anonymity if we're going to put our biometrics on some third-party server or somewhere that's off of our device. If we're going to go in and make a retail payment at your local grocery store and you love this feature, well, you also have to understand that now that company or the vendor that they have to service that data has now gotten you associated with a biometric marker. And so you do lose some level of anonymity. I'm really glad to hear that we're going to just keep repeating what's considered to be the gold standard of multi-factor authentication. This is such a great way to minimize the friction of your customer experience and make sure that your reaction to a potential fraud flag is proportionate to that fraud flag. So if your only hammer to stop fraud is to suspend accounts, are you really giving the person a time to still engage with your product while also being limited with their features while you sort out the identity piece or that fraud piece that alerted you to that customer's program or account? So I definitely think that we're going to continue to push multi-factor authentication, and I highly encourage you to consider biometrics as part of that multi-factor authentication.